The dashboard clock glowed 6:30 a.m. as Daniel gripped the steering wheel, fighting to keep his eyes open. Another night shift at the warehouse was behind him, and his body ached in ways he'd gotten used to over the years. In the back seat, his two daughters were fast asleep. 10-year-old Sophie had her head resting against the window, and 7-year-old Grace was curled up with her worn stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. The morning fog was thick, the kind that made everything look gray and ghostly. Daniel had driven this route home 1,000 times, maybe more. He knew every curve, every pothole, every faded road sign. His mind was already jumping ahead to what needed to happen next. Get the girls home, make breakfast, help them get ready for school, then try to grab 2 hours of sleep before his afternoon shift as a janitor at the elementary school. It was the same exhausting cycle day after day. That's when he saw it. Through the fog, there were skid marks on the road, dark and fresh. His eyes followed them to the right, where an expensive-looking car sat nose down in the ditch. The front end was crumpled against a tree. Daniel's first instinct was the same as anyone's. Part of him wanted to keep driving. He was tired. The girls needed to get home. He had maybe 15 minutes before Sophie's alarm would go off, and she'd wake up confused about where they were. But he couldn't do it. He just couldn't drive past. Daniel pulled his old pickup truck onto the shoulder and put on his hazard lights. He looked back at his daughters. Still sleeping, thank God. He didn't want them to see anything scary. Grabbing his phone, he stepped out into the cold morning air. His breath came out in small clouds. The closer he got to the wrecked car, the worse it looked. The windshield had a spider web of cracks spreading from the driver's side. The driver's door was bent inward. Daniel's heart started beating faster. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 as he approached, reporting the accident and giving the location as best he could. They were on Highway 47, about 12 miles outside of town. Not exactly a place where help arrived quickly. He ended the call and peered through the window. A man was slumped over the steering wheel, maybe in his early 60s. Blood trickled down from a cut on his temple. He was wearing what looked like an expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained. A watch that probably cost more than Daniel made in 6 months caught the dim light. "Sir, can you hear me?" Daniel tried the door. Locked. He knocked on the window, louder this time. "Sir?" The man stirred slightly, letting out a low groan. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. Daniel tried the passenger side. Also locked. He looked around, weighing his options. The ambulance was coming, but how long would it take? What if this man was bleeding internally? What if every minute mattered? Daniel made a decision. He went back to his truck, pulled out the small emergency kit he kept under the seat. It wasn't much. Some bandages, a small flashlight, a blanket, the kind of stuff you hope you never need but keep around just in case. Sophie had woken up and was looking at him through the window with sleepy, worried eyes. He walked back to her side and opened the door just a crack. "Hey, sweetheart. There's been an accident. I need you to stay right here with your sister, okay? Lock the doors and don't get out. I'm going to help someone." "Is he hurt bad, Dad?" Sophie's voice was small. "I don't know yet, honey, but I'm going to make sure he's okay. You're in charge of Grace. Can you do that for me?" Sophie nodded, suddenly looking much older than 10. Daniel closed the door and heard the locks click. "Good girl." Back at the wrecked car, Daniel noticed the driver's window had a small opening at the top. He could reach his hand through. After some awkward maneuvering, he managed to unlock the door from the inside. The smell hit him immediately. Airbag powder, something burning, and blood. The man was breathing, but it was shallow and irregular. "Sir, I'm going to help you. The ambulance is coming." Daniel carefully checked the man's neck and spine, remembering what little first aid he'd learned years ago at a warehouse safety training. Everything seemed stable enough. The man's eyes opened, unfocused and confused. "What? Where?" the man mumbled. "You were in an accident. You're going to be okay. What's your name?" "Richard. Richard." The man's hand came up weakly, touching the blood on his face. He looked at his fingers, confused. "I have to. Meeting." "They're waiting?" "The meeting can wait. You need to stay still." Daniel pressed a clean cloth from his kit against the head wound. It wasn't deep, but head wounds always bled like crazy. "I'm Daniel. Help is on the way." Richard's eyes focused on him for the first time. "You stopped. Nobody stopped." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. How long had Richard been here? How many cars had driven past, too busy or too scared to get involved? He thought about his daughters in the truck, about how he'd almost kept driving too. "Of course I stopped. Daniel said quietly. Anyone would. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The evidence was right there. The other cars that had driven past had left their own tire marks in the morning dew on the road. Time seemed to move strangely. Daniel kept Richard talking, asking him questions about anything he could think of. Where was he going? Did he have family? What was the meeting about? Richard's answers were scattered and confused, but at least he was conscious. At one point, Richard grabbed Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. My phone. Need to call. Tell them. Richard looked around frantically. Daniel spotted the phone on the floor of the passenger side. Screen shattered into 1,000 pieces. It's broken. We can make calls later. Right now, you need to focus on staying awake for me, Richard. Sophie appeared beside the car, making Daniel jump. Dad, Grace needs you. She's scared and asking for you. Daniel looked torn between the injured man and his daughter. Richard saw his expression and managed a weak smile. Go, I'm okay for a minute. Daniel squeezed Richard's shoulder and jogged back to the truck. Grace was crying softly, her face pressed against the window. He opened the door and pulled her into a hug. It's okay, baby. Everything's okay. Dad's helping someone who got hurt, but he's going to be fine. I want to go home, Grace whimpered. I know. Soon, I promise. Can you be brave for just a little longer? Grace nodded against his chest. Sophie patted her sister's back, trying to comfort her. Daniel felt a surge of pride in his daughters mixed with guilt that they had to see this, had to wait in the cold while he helped a stranger. The sound of sirens finally cut through the morning air. Relief washed over Daniel like a wave. He kissed Grace's forehead and went back to Richard, who was looking worse. His skin had gone pale and clammy. Hear that? That's your ride. You're going to be just fine. The ambulance pulled up, lights flashing red and blue through the fog. 2 paramedics jumped out with practiced efficiency. Daniel stepped back, giving them room to work. They asked him quick questions. How long had he been here? Was Richard conscious the whole time? Any other injuries he could see? Daniel answered as best he could, feeling suddenly useless now that the professionals had arrived. They got Richard onto a stretcher, neck brace in place, moving with careful speed. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Richard's eyes found Daniel's. He reached out a hand and Daniel took it. Don't leave. I need to thank you properly. Please. Richard's voice was urgent despite his weakness. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, pulled out a clipboard. Sir, can you give us your contact information? Mr. Westbrook here seems pretty insistent about it. Daniel rattled off his phone number and address while watching them secure. Richard inside the ambulance, Westbrook, the name tickled something in the back of his mind, but he was too tired to place it. You did good, the female paramedic said, giving Daniel's shoulder a quick pat, keeping him conscious, stopping the bleeding. You might have saved his life. The ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing. Daniel stood there on the side of the road, watching until the red lights disappeared into the fog. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off. He looked down and saw blood on his shirt, on his hands. Richard's blood. Back in the truck, Sophie and Grace were both awake now, watching him with wide eyes. He climbed in, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His whole body felt heavy. Is the man going to be okay? Sophie asked. I think so. The doctors will take good care of him. You were really brave, Dad, Grace said softly. Daniel started the truck and pulled back onto the highway. I just did what anyone should do, sweetie. They drove home in silence. The fog was starting to lift as the sun came up. Daniel's mind kept replaying the moment when he'd seen the skid marks. That split second when he'd decided to stop. What if he hadn't? What if he'd been like all those other drivers? By the time they got home, they were running 2 hours late. Sophie and Grace would miss the school bus. Daniel would have to drive them, which meant he'd be late for his next shift. His boss at the school wouldn't be happy, but somehow, none of that seemed to matter much right now. He helped the girls inside, started making breakfast with whatever was in the fridge. Eggs, toast, the last of the orange juice. Sophie set the table without being asked. Grace got out the plates. They moved around the small kitchen like a well-practiced team. Dad? Sophie said as they sat down to eat. That man's watch looked really expensive. I noticed that too. Do you think he's rich? Daniel shrugged. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel had almost convinced himself that the incident on the highway was just going to be one of those things. A story he'd tell someday, maybe. The kind of thing that sounds more dramatic in the retelling than it felt at the time. He'd given his number to the paramedics, but his phone never rang with an unfamiliar number. Life just kept moving forward the way it always did, with bills and responsibilities and not enough hours in the day. Except life was moving forward a little harder than usual. His landlord, Mr. Peterson, had stopped by 2 weeks ago with news that made Daniel's stomach drop. Rent was going up. Not by a little either. An extra $200 a month starting next month. Mr. Peterson had been apologetic about it, but apologetic didn't pay bills. Daniel had nodded, said he understood, and closed the door before the panic could show on his face. $200 might not sound like much to some people, but when you're already juggling 2 jobs and barely keeping your head above water, $200 might as well be $2,000. It meant Daniel would need to pick up extra shifts. It meant maybe the girls would have to skip their after-school program to save money. It meant a lot of things he didn't want to think about. Then there was Sophie's glasses. She'd been squinting at the TV for weeks now, sitting closer and closer. Daniel had noticed but kept putting off the eye doctor, telling himself it could wait another month. But her teacher had sent home a note saying Sophie was having trouble seeing the board. She needed glasses, and glasses cost money Daniel didn't have, and the truck. Oh, the truck. His faithful, beaten-up pickup that had been with him for 12 years was making a new sound. A grinding, whining noise every time he shifted gears. Daniel knew that sound. It was the transmission giving up. He'd looked up the repair cost online one night after the girls went to bed. Anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000. He'd closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, doing math in his head that never quite added up. Saturday morning, Daniel was in the backyard trying to fix the fence. 3 of the boards had rotted through, and he was attempting to replace them with some cheap wood from the hardware store. Sophie and Grace were inside, supposedly cleaning their room, but probably playing instead. He could hear their laughter through the open window, and it made him smile despite everything. That's when he heard a car pull up out front. Not unusual. Their street got plenty of traffic. But then came the knock on the door, firm and professional. Daniel set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans. Probably someone selling something. He prepared his polite no thank you as he walked through the house. Through the front door's small window, he could see a woman standing on his porch. She was wearing a sharp business suit, the kind you see in movies about lawyers or executives. Her car, parked at the curb, was sleek and black and probably cost more than Daniel would make in 5 years. This definitely wasn't someone selling magazine subscriptions. Daniel opened the door, suddenly aware of his old t-shirt with the hole in the sleeve and the paint stains on his jeans. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled. Professional, polite, but with warmth behind it. "Daniel Morrison? I'm Patricia Reeves. I'm sorry to show up unannounced like this. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Depends on what we're talking about," Daniel said carefully. Was this about his taxes? Had he forgotten to pay something? His mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. "It's about Richard Westbrook, the man you helped 3 weeks ago on Highway 47. Daniel felt his shoulders relax a fraction. "Oh, is he okay? I never heard anything after the ambulance took him. He's doing very well, thanks to you. May I come in? I promise this won't take long." Daniel hesitated, then stepped aside. The living room was clean, but cluttered with the kind of stuff you get when you have kids and not much money. Toys in a basket by the couch. Library books stacked on the coffee table. A blanket draped over the chair that had seen better days. Patricia didn't seem to notice or care. She sat on the couch like she was in a fancy office instead of Daniel's modest living room. "Dad? Who is it?" Sophie appeared in the hallway, Grace peeking around her shoulder. "Just someone here to talk about that man I helped a few weeks ago. Why don't you 2 go finish your room? I'll call you when we're done." The girls disappeared, but Daniel knew they were probably listening from the hallway. Kids always did. Patricia pulled a leather folder from her bag and set it on the coffee table. "Mr. Morrison, I'll get right to the point. I'm Mr. Westbrook's attorney. He's been trying to find you since the accident. The paramedics had my number. I figured if he wanted to reach me, he could just call." Patricia's smile turned a bit sad. "That's the thing. Richard had a severe concussion. The first week after the accident, he barely remembered his own name, let alone yours. He couldn't remember the name of the man who saved him. Just that you had 2 daughters and drove an old pickup truck. Once his memory started coming back, he had me tracking you down. It took some work, but we got there." Daniel felt strange hearing this. He hadn't thought of himself as someone who'd saved anyone. He'd just stopped because someone needed help. I'm glad he's okay, but I don't understand why you're here. Patricia opened the folder. Inside were several papers that looked official and intimidating. Richard Westbrook is not a man who forgets his debts. He wants to thank you personally. He'd like to invite you and your daughters to his home next weekend if you're available. That's really not necessary. I was just doing what anyone would do. That's exactly what Richard said you'd say. Patricia pulled out another paper. This one a check. She set it on the table facing Daniel. This is just for the inconvenience. For being late to work that day. For the gas. For stopping when others didn't. Daniel looked at the check. Then he looked again. $5,000. The numbers seemed to swim in front of his eyes. He actually felt dizzy. I can't accept this, he said, but his voice came out hoarse. His mind was already doing that math again. $5,000 would cover the rent increase for months. Would fix the truck. Would get Sophie her glasses and new shoes and that science kit she'd been wanting. Would let them breathe for just a little while. You can and you will, Patricia said gently. And before you argue more, understand that this isn't the thank you. This is just a token until Richard can thank you properly in person. He's quite insistent about meeting you. Daniel's hands were shaking as he picked up the check. The paper felt impossibly light for something that represented so much. I don't understand. Who is Richard Westbrook, really? Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. You don't know? Richard is the founder and CEO of Westbrook Industries. It's a manufacturing company. They make parts for everything from cars to medical equipment. The company's worth several $100 million. The room felt too small suddenly. Daniel set the check down like it might burn him. I pulled a millionaire out of a crashed car. A multimillionaire, technically. But yes. And Richard is a man who believes in honoring his debts and recognizing good people. So will you come next Saturday? 2 o'clock? Daniel wanted to say no. Every instinct told him that his world and Richard Westbrook's world were too different, that nothing good could come from mixing them. But he looked at that check again, thought about Sophie needing glasses, about the truck's dying transmission, about the rent increase he couldn't afford. Okay, he heard himself say. We'll come. Patricia smiled and handed him a card with an address on it. Perfect. Richard will be very pleased. And Mr. Morrison, don't worry too much. Richard is wealthy, but he's also a good man. He doesn't forget where he came from. After Patricia left, Daniel sat alone in the living room for a long time, holding the check. Sophie and Grace crept out from their hiding spot in the hallway. Dad, how much is that for? Sophie asked, her eyes wide. Daniel showed them. Both girls gasped. Grace actually put her hand over her mouth. Are we rich now? Grace asked in a whisper. Daniel pulled both girls into a hug. No, baby. We're not rich, but we can fix some things that have been broken, and maybe you can get those dance classes you wanted. Really? Grace's whole face lit up. She'd been asking about dance classes for a year, and Daniel had to say no every time. It had broken his heart a little more each time. Really? Aunt Sophie, we're getting you glasses this week. That night after the girls were in bed, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the check in front of him. He'd already called his bank and verified it was real. The money would clear in 2 business days. 2 days and his immediate problems would be solved. Not all of them. Not forever, but enough to breathe. He thought about Richard, lying in a hospital bed with a concussion, trying to remember the name of someone he'd seen for maybe 15 minutes. What kind of person did that? Most people would just be grateful to be alive and move on. But Richard had spent weeks searching for him. The week passed in a blur. Daniel deposited the check and watched his bank account suddenly have commas in it, for the first time in years. He took Sophie to the eye doctor and got her glasses, purple frames she picked out herself. He scheduled the truck repair, wincing at the cost but knowing he could finally afford it. He signed Grace up for dance classes at the community center. Every time he did something that had been impossible before, he felt a strength. They sat in Richard's sunlit room, and for a moment nobody spoke. Daniel felt like he was in a dream. The chairs were more comfortable than his bed at home. Through the massive windows he could see grounds that seemed to go on forever. A pool, gardens, what looked like a guest house that was bigger than most regular houses. Richard noticed him looking and smiled. It's a lot, isn't it? I remember the first time I saw this place. I'd just sold my company's first major contract. I thought I'd made it. Now it just feels empty most days. There was something sad in the way he said it. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. How do you comfort a millionaire about his mansion feeling empty? Mr. Westbrook, Daniel started. Richard, please. Mr. Westbrook is what my employees call me when they're about to ask for a raise. He smiled, and Daniel found himself smiling back. Richard, I'm grateful for the money, more than you know. But you didn't have to. I was just doing what anyone should do. Richard leaned forward, his expression growing serious. That's where you're wrong. That morning, do you know how many cars drove past me before you stopped? Daniel shook his head. 17. I counted them while I was fading in and out. 17 cars saw my skid marks, saw my wrecked car in the ditch and kept driving. Maybe they were late for work. Maybe they didn't want to get involved. Maybe they were scared, but they all kept going. Richard paused, his hand unconsciously touching the scar on his temple. You were the 18th car. And you stopped? Sophie, who'd been quiet, spoke up. We were late for school. Dad was late for work, too. Richard looked at her with respect, and he stopped anyway. That tells me everything I need to know about your father. Grace had been staring at everything in the room with wide eyes. Is that a real painting? She pointed at something on the wall that looked old and important. Richard laughed, the heaviness lifting. It is. Would you like to see more? I have a small gallery upstairs. My wife collected art. His voice caught slightly on the word wife. She passed away 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly. My wife, the girl's mother, she left when Grace was a baby. It's been just the three of us since then. Something shifted in Richard's expression, understanding maybe, or recognition. Single parent? Yeah, it's hard sometimes, I can imagine. My children were already grown when I lost Helen, but I understand something of what it means to suddenly be doing it alone. Richard stood up. Let me show you and the girls around a bit. Then we can talk business. Business? Daniel's stomach clenched. He didn't like the sound of that, but Richard was already moving, leading them out of the room. He showed them the house, but not in a showing-off way. More like someone who wanted to share something with friends. The girls loved the library, a huge room with shelves floor to ceiling. Grace found a children's book about ballet and held it like treasure until Richard told her she could keep it. They saw the pool, the gardens, even the garage with its collection of cars that made Daniel's dying truck look like a toy. But Richard didn't linger there. He seemed more interested in showing them a workshop in the back, filled with tools and half-finished projects. This is where I actually spend most of my time, Richard said, running his hand over a workbench, building things, fixing things. The business runs itself mostly these days, but I can't seem to stop working with my hands. Daniel felt himself relax even more. This was something he understood. I get that. I'm trying to rebuild a fence in my backyard. Not going great, but I keep at it. Nothing ever goes great the first time, Richard said. That's how you know you're learning. They ended up back in the sunny room. Richard's butler, whose name was apparently Thomas, brought in lemonade and cookies. The girls settled on the floor with their drinks and the book Richard had given Grace, content to flip through it while the adults talked. Daniel, Richard began, and his tone shifted to something more serious. I want to tell you about the morning of the accident. I think it's important you understand. Daniel nodded, listening. I'd gotten a call at 4 a.m. My company was under attack. A hostile takeover. Another corporation was trying to buy us out, planning to break us up and sell the pieces. Everything I'd built over 40 years was about to be destroyed. I had an emergency board meeting scheduled for 7. I was driving too fast, too distracted, too angry. I missed the curve. Richard's hands tightened on his armrest. It was my own fault. All of it. Did they take over the company? Daniel asked. No, but only because the accident delayed everything. While I was in the hospital, my daughter Caroline rallied the board. They found a defense strategy I'd been too panicked to see. We survived, barely. Richard looked directly at Daniel. But here's what I realized while I was lying in that hospital bed trying to remember your name. I'd spent 40 years building something, and I'd almost died for it. And in that moment when I was bleeding and confused and scared, none of it mattered. The company, the money, the deals, none of it. What mattered was that a stranger stopped to help me. A man with 2 kids and probably a dozen reasons to keep driving stopped, because it was the right thing to do. Daniel felt uncomfortable with the weight Richard was putting on his decision. Anyone would have. No, Richard interrupted gently but firmly. Anyone wouldn't have. 17 cars prove that you did. And I started thinking about why. What kind of person does that? What kind of person stops when they're already stretched thin? When they're already late, when they have kids in the car depending on them? Someone with integrity? Someone with compassion? Someone who understands what really matters? I don't know if I'm all that, Daniel said honestly. I'm just trying to get by most days. That's exactly my point. Richard leaned forward again. You're trying to get by and you still stopped. That's character. That's the kind of person I want in my life. And that's why I have a proposition for you. Daniel's hands went cold. Here it came. Whatever this really was. What kind of proposition? I want to hire you. Of all the things Daniel had expected, that wasn't it. He actually laughed, more from nervousness than humor. Hire me? To do what? I'm a warehouse worker and a janitor. I barely finished high school. I don't think I'm qualified to work at a manufacturing company. You're more qualified than you think. Let me explain. Richard pulled out a folder from beside his chair, much like Patricia had done the week before. After the accident, I spent a lot of time thinking about my life, my company, my legacy. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. The company will continue with or without me, but what am I leaving behind that matters? What good am I doing? He opened the folder showing Daniel papers and charts that didn't mean much to him. I want to start a new division at Westbrook Industries. A community outreach program, something that actually helps people, not just charity donations, real programs. Job training, family support, childcare assistance, educational opportunities, things that make a real difference in people's lives. Daniel was following, but he still didn't see where he fit in. That sounds good. I need someone to run it. Someone who understands what working families actually need. Someone who knows what it's like to choose between fixing their car and buying groceries. Someone who knows what matters because they live it every day. Richard looked at Daniel steadily. I need you. The room seemed to tilt. Sophie and Grace had stopped looking at the book and were watching their father with wide eyes. Daniel's mouth was dry despite the lemonade. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. I'll pay you $85,000 a year to start. Full health benefits for you and the girls. College fund for both Sophie and Grace, fully funded. And I'll help you find better housing. Something safe in a good school district. The numbers didn't make sense. $85,000. Daniel made about $32,000 between both his jobs, working himself to exhaustion. This was more than double, more than he'd ever dreamed of making. I don't have a degree, Daniel said weakly. I don't have experience with this kind of thing. You have life experience. That's worth more than any degree for this job. You know what it's like to struggle. You know what help looks like when you need it. You know the difference between charity that makes the giver feel good and support that actually changes lives. Richard's voice was passionate now. I have plenty of people with business degrees. I need someone real, someone authentic, someone who will tell me when my ideas are out of touch with reality. Daniel's mind was racing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. What if I fail? What if I don't know what I'm doing? Then I'll teach you what you need to know about business. And you'll teach me what I need to know about reality. We'll figure it out together. Richard smiled. Daniel, I'm not expecting you to have all the answers. I'm expecting you to ask the right questions. There's a difference. Sophie tugged on Daniel's sleeve. He looked down at her and she whispered, Dad, this is good, right? This would be good for us. Grace was nodding hopefully beside her sister. Both girls looked at him with such trust, such hope, that Daniel felt his chest tighten. He'd spent their whole lives trying to give them what they needed, always coming up short, always saying no to things they wanted because there just wasn't money, always working multiple jobs and still barely making. Daniel said yes. After 3 days of thinking, of running numbers, of talking to Sophie and Grace until late at night, he called Richard and accepted the job. 2 weeks later, he started at Westbrook Industries and his entire world shifted on its axis. The first day was overwhelming. He showed up in a new suit he'd bought on sale, feeling like he was playing dress-up. The Westbrook Industries building was all glass and steel, towering 12 stories high. Inside, everyone moved with purpose, talking on phones, carrying tablets, walking fast. Daniel felt like he was moving in slow motion, trying to keep up with a world that spoke a language he hadn't learned yet. Richard met him in the lobby himself, which Daniel learned later was unusual. CEOs didn't typically greet new employees, but Richard wasn't typical. He took Daniel up to the 10th floor where his new office was. An actual office with a door and a window. Daniel had never had an office before. He'd had lockers at the warehouse and a supply closet at the school. But an office? With his name on the door? "This is yours," Richard said, gesturing to the space. "You can decorate it however you want. Make it feel like home." The office was bigger than Daniel's bedroom. It had a desk, a computer, bookshelves, and 2 chairs for visitors. The window looked out over the city. Daniel could see for miles. "I don't know what I'm doing," Daniel said honestly, staring at the computer like it might bite him. "Nobody does on their first day, but I'm going to help you. We're going to build this program together." Richard sat in one of the visitor chairs, making himself comfortable. "First things first. I need you to tell me what your life was like before. Not just the facts. The reality. What did a typical day look like?" So Daniel told him. He talked about waking up at 4:30 for his warehouse shift, about the way his back ached from lifting boxes, about coming home to get the girls ready for school, then trying to catch 2 hours of sleep before his janitorial job, about the constant math in his head, balancing bills against income always coming up short, about the stress of one unexpected expense meaning disaster. Richard listened to all of it, taking notes on a legal pad. He asked questions that cut to the heart of things. What would have helped most? What programs existed that didn't actually help? What did people need versus what did they get? Transportation, Daniel found himself saying. That's huge. You know how many people lose their jobs because their car breaks down, or they can't afford gas, or the bus schedule doesn't match their shift? It's not that people don't want to work. It's that getting to work is harder than the work itself sometimes. Richard wrote it down. What else? Childcare. I'm lucky. Sophie's old enough to watch Grace for a couple hours if she has to. But most single parents, they're paying someone more than they're making, just so they can go to work. It doesn't make sense. They work to pay for childcare so they can work. They talked for 3 hours that first day. Richard soaking up everything Daniel said, Daniel slowly realizing that his experience mattered, that the years of struggle weren't wasted. They were education. They were research. They were expertise in something that couldn't be taught in school. The next few weeks were a crash course in business. Richard taught him about budgets and proposals, about board meetings and presentations. Daniel learned how to use spreadsheet software and email and all the tools he'd need. It was exhausting. His brain hurt from learning so much so fast. But Richard was patient, never making him feel stupid, always explaining things clearly. Daniel also met the other executives. Some were welcoming. They'd shake his hand, ask about his background, seem genuinely interested in what he was building. Others were less friendly. They'd nod politely, but Daniel could see the questions in their eyes. Who is this guy? Why is Richard giving him so much attention? What makes him qualified? The worst was Gregory Hartwell, the vice president of operations. He was probably 50, with perfectly styled gray hair and suits that cost more than Daniel used to make in a month. From the first meeting, Gregory made his opinion clear. "So you're Richard's new pet project," Gregory said the first time they were introduced. His smile didn't reach his eyes. How nice that he's feeling charitable these days. Daniel felt his face heat up but kept his voice level. "I'm here to develop community outreach programs." "Yes, I heard. Using company resources for social work. I'm sure the shareholders will love that." Gregory walked away before Daniel could respond. Richard noticed the interaction and pulled Daniel aside later. "Don't let Gregory get to you. He's old school. He thinks business is only about profit margins and quarterly reports. He doesn't understand that investing in people is investing in the future." But Gregory's attitude bothered Daniel more than he wanted to admit. Because part of him wondered if Gregory was right. Was he really qualified for this? Or was he just here because Richard felt guilty about being rich while Daniel struggled? Was this whole thing just elaborate charity dressed up as a job? 3 months in, Daniel had his first big test. He developed a proposal for the community program. It included a transportation assistance fund, a childcare partnership with local providers, job training programs, and emergency financial support for employees facing unexpected hardships. The budget was substantial. $2 million in the first year, with plans to expand based on results. He had to present it to the board of directors. 20 people in suits sitting around a massive conference table, looking at him expectantly. Daniel's hands were sweating as he set up his presentation. He'd practiced with Richard a dozen times, but standing here, facing all these powerful people, he felt like that warehouse worker again. Out of place, unqualified, fake. He started talking, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. He explained the programs, showed the research, presented the budget. He talked about return on investment in terms they'd understand, but also in terms of human cost. What did it cost the company when good employees left because they couldn't afford childcare? When skilled workers couldn't get to their shifts? When people's lives fell apart over a $500 emergency? The board listened. Some nodded. Some took notes. Some, including Gregory, sat with their arms crossed, expressions skeptical. When Daniel finished, the questions came. Most were reasonable, asking about implementation details and success metrics. Then Gregory raised his hand. This all sounds very heartwarming, Gregory said, his tone making it clear that wasn't a compliment. But let's talk reality. $2 million for what amounts to charity. How does this benefit Westbrook Industries? What's our actual return? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like an expensive way for our CEO to feel good about himself. The room went quiet. Daniel felt his face burn, but he also felt something else. Anger. Not at the question, but at the implication. That helping people was just about feeling good. That there was no value in making lives better. You want to talk about return on investment? Daniel said, his voice steady now. Let's talk about it. Last year, Westbrook Industries had a 23% turnover rate in entry-level positions. You know what it costs to replace an employee? Conservative estimates say 1.5 times their annual salary. That's recruiting, training, lost productivity while the new person gets up to speed. For a company this size, that 23% turnover cost you approximately $8 million. He had everyone's attention now. Even Gregory leaned forward slightly. Industry studies show that companies with strong employee support programs reduce turnover by 30 to 40%. Let's be conservative and say we only reduce it by 25%. That's a 5.75% reduction in turnover rate, which saves approximately $2 million. Right there, the program pays for itself. And that's not counting increased productivity from employees who aren't stressed about childcare or car repairs. Not counting the community goodwill that translates to better hiring pools and customer loyalty. Not counting the fact that we'd be doing the right thing. Daniel clicked to his final slide, which showed all these numbers in a clear chart. So yes, Mr. Hartwell, there's a return on investment. A significant one. But even if there wasn't, even if this cost us money, I'd still argue we should do it. Because companies don't exist in a vacuum. They're made of people. And when you invest in people, everyone benefits. The room was silent. Then Richard started clapping. A few others joined in. Not everyone, but enough. Gregory's face was stony, but he didn't argue further. The board voted. The program passed. 14-6. Daniel had done it. He'd defended his work against people with decades more experience, and he'd won. After the meeting, Richard pulled him aside, his face bright with pride. That was excellent. You stood your ground and backed up everything with solid data. I couldn't have done it better myself. Thanks. Though I think I made an enemy. Daniel glanced at Gregory, who was talking to some other board members, casting dark looks in their direction. Gregory was my enemy long before you came along. Don't worry about him. You did the right thing. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. Now comes the hard part. Actually making this thing work. And it was hard. Daniel threw himself into the program, working long hours but different hours. Instead of physical labor that left him exhausted, it was mental work that left him energized. He interviewed employees, talked. 18 months after that foggy morning on the highway, Daniel stood in front of a room full of business leaders and journalists, accepting an award for innovative corporate responsibility. The program he'd built had been recognized nationally. Other companies were reaching out, asking how Westbrook Industries had reduced turnover and increased productivity. Daniel had become something he never expected, an expert. Richard sat in the audience, beaming like a proud father. Carolyn sat beside him, clapping enthusiastically. Even some of the board members who'd voted against the program initially were there, nodding with approval. The program had exceeded every projection. It wasn't just good for employees, it was good for business, but Daniel could barely enjoy the moment. Because Richard wasn't well, it had started small. Richard getting tired more easily, needing to sit down after walking to meetings, brushing it off his age as working too hard. But 3 weeks ago, he'd collapsed in his office. The diagnosis was serious, a heart condition that required major surgery. The doctors said he'd been living with it for years, probably since before the accident. The stress from the takeover attempt and the crash had made it worse. Richard was scheduled for surgery in 2 days. Open heart surgery with all the risks that implied. He was 70 years old. He might not make it, and David was making his move. The day after Richard's collapse, David had called an emergency board meeting. With Richard in the hospital, David was acting CEO. He'd presented a proposal to restructure the company, to cut costs and streamline operations. And right at the top of his list, eliminating Daniel's community program. It served its purpose, David had said smoothly. We've gotten the good press. We've proven we care. But it's time to be realistic. $2 million a year is significant. We could put that money into expansion, into increasing shareholder value. Daniel had fought back, presenting all his data again. The retention numbers, the productivity increases, the community goodwill that translated to easier hiring and customer loyalty. But without Richard there to back him up, the board was split. They'd tabled the decision until after Richard's surgery. The message was clear. If Richard didn't make it, the program was done. And so was Daniel. Caroline had warned him privately. David's been waiting for this. Not for Dad to get sick, he's not that cold, but for a chance to take control. He thinks Dad's gotten too soft, too focused on legacy instead of profit. If the surgery doesn't go well, he'll dismantle everything Dad built in the last 2 years. Now, holding this award, Daniel felt like it was made of sand, something that could slip through his fingers at any moment. He gave his acceptance speech thanking Richard and his team, talking about why this work mattered. But his mind was on the hospital, on Richard lying in a bed preparing for surgery that might save him or might end everything. After the ceremony, Daniel went straight to the hospital. He'd been visiting every day, usually bringing Sophie and Grace. Richard loved seeing them. He'd tell them stories about building his company, about his own children when they were young, about his wife and how much he missed her. The girls would tell him about school and dance and science club. It felt like family. Today, Richard was alone in his room, staring out the window. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital gown and the IV lines. But when he saw Daniel, his face lit up. How was the ceremony? Did you give them hell? I accepted the award. Made a speech. The usual. Daniel sat in the chair beside the bed. You should have been there. I was there in spirit. Besides, that award is yours. You built that program. You made it work. I just gave you the chance. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard spoke again, his voice more serious. Daniel, I need to talk to you about something. The surgery tomorrow. There's a chance I don't make it. Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. Maybe, hopefully. But I'm 70 years old with a bad heart. I need to be realistic. Richard shifted in bed, looking directly at Daniel. If something happens to me, David is going to shut down your program. I know. Caroline will fight for it, but she doesn't have enough board support yet. David has been cultivating allies for years. He'll win. Richard reached over and grabbed a folder from his bedside table. So I've made arrangements. He handed the folder to Daniel. Inside were legal documents, dense with words Daniel had to read twice to understand. But the core message was clear. Richard was creating a foundation independent of Westbrook Industries. He was funding it with $50 million from his personal fortune. The foundation's sole purpose was to continue and expand the community programs Daniel had started. Richard, this is too much. Daniel's hands were shaking. It's not nearly enough for what you've done, but it ensures the work continues no matter what David does to the company. The foundation will have its own board, its own staff. You'll be the executive director. Caroline has agreed to be on the board. She believes in this as much as we do. Daniel felt tears stinging his eyes. You didn't have to do this. Yes, I did. Because this is my legacy, not the company. Not the money, this helping people who need it. Giving people chances. Making the world a little bit better. Richard's voice grew softer. You taught me that, Daniel. When you stopped on that highway, when you helped a stranger for no reason except it was right, you reminded me what matters. I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure that lesson continues. You're going to have plenty of time left, Daniel said, but his voice broke. I hope so. I'd like to see Sophie graduate high school. Take her to look at colleges, see Grace dance in a real production, watch you build this foundation into something extraordinary. Richard smiled. But if I don't, I need to know it's in good hands, and it is. You've got this. The surgery was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Daniel took the day off work. Sophie and Grace had school, but he'd promised to text them updates. He sat in the waiting room with Caroline and David. The tension between the siblings was obvious. They spoke politely but coolly to each other. David barely acknowledged Daniel's presence. Hours passed. Daniel paced. He tried to read magazines but couldn't focus. He got coffee and didn't drink it. He checked his phone obsessively even though he knew the surgeon would come out to talk to them in person. 5 hours into the surgery, David's phone rang. He stepped away to take the call and Caroline moved closer to Daniel. He showed me the foundation documents, she said quietly. It's brilliant. David's furious, of course. He thinks Dad's giving away his inheritance, is he? Some of it. But Dad has more than enough for all of us. David's just greedy. He wants it all. She looked toward where her brother stood, talking intensely on the phone. He's not a bad person. He's just lost. He thinks money and power are what matter. Dad used to think that too before the accident. Before you. I didn't do anything special. You did the hardest thing there is. You stayed human while life tried to make you hard. You kept your compassion when you had every reason to lose it. Caroline smiled sadly. That's what Dad saw in you. That's what he wants to protect. 6 hours, then 7. Daniel's legs ached from pacing. His stomach was in knots. He'd prayed even though he wasn't sure he believed in prayer. He'd made bargains with the universe. He'd done everything except the one thing he needed to do. Wait. Finally, at hour 8, a surgeon in blue scrubs came through the double doors. Her face was tired but smiling. Family of Richard Westbrook. They all jumped up. Caroline grabbed Daniel's hand. David stepped forward, his CEO mask in place. The surgery was successful. There were some complications, which is why it took longer than expected, but we repaired the damage. His heart is functioning well. He's going to need extensive recovery time, but he should make a full recovery. The relief was so intense Daniel thought his knees might give out. Caroline was crying, laughing, hugging him. Even David's mask cracked, and he looked genuinely happy for a moment. When can we see him? Caroline asked. He's in recovery now. Probably another hour before he's awake enough for visitors. Just family for now. He's family, Caroline said firmly, gesturing to Daniel. The surgeon nodded and left. David looked at Daniel, and for a moment something like respect passed across his face. He really cares about you. I thought it was just guilt or a phase, but he really sees you as family. He's been more of a father to me than my own dad was, Daniel said honestly. I know that's hard for you. I know you think I'm taking something from you. But I'm not trying to replace you. I'm just trying to be worthy of the chance he gave me. David was quiet for a long moment. The foundation? You could have just kept working at the company. Taken the salary. But this foundation, it means you actually believe in this stuff. Of course I do. I lived it. I know what a difference these programs make. My dad almost died, David said, his voice rough. When I got the call that he collapsed, all I could think about was all the time I spent being angry at him for paying attention to you. For changing after the accident. And I realized I was angry at the wrong person. I was angry at him for becoming someone better. David held out his hand. Daniel shook it, surprised. I still think the company needs to focus on profits. That's my job. But maybe Dad's right that business can be about more than just money. Maybe there's room for both. David pulled his hand back, his CEO